Thank y'all all for coming out. That sounds a lot fancier than I am. And she gave the warning about expletives, so if you're offended by expletives, this is also the wrong place for you. So if you're expecting elbow patches and a real high conversation, this is most assuredly not the event that you were looking for. How many people in the room have read my work in the past? Okay, so everybody here. The reason I ask is that this work is largely a departure from a whole lot of the things that I've done in the past. When I go back and look at especially those first three novels, it was very much a matter of seeing how fast I could make the train move. It was like me shoveling coal and just seeing how quickly I could make a narrative move. And after the line that held us, there was kind of a deliberate shift. And I don't know that it was fully deliberate at the time, but there was a shift that took place where all of a sudden I started, the novels became social novels in ways that those first three novels weren't. And so with When These Mountains Burn, that was a book that was very much a book that was addressing the opioid epidemic in Appalachia. And it was because, it was something that had become an inignorable presence of my day-to-day life, which is that every day, I had people knocking on my doors, asking for sewing needles to skin pop. I would go to the post office and step out and there'd be needles all over the ground. I would drive through town and deputies and paramedics would be pulling bodies from under bridges, which is to say that, you could not look away from it. And it felt inauthentic for the work not to address that in some capacity. And so there was a shift that took place between the line that held us and When These Mountains Burn, where the work started to take on a social context in ways that the earlier stuff hadn't. And I can remember sitting at an event with Megan Abbott, who I love. I think Megan Abbott is one of the greatest writers working in America. She has a new novel called Beware the Woman, if you're looking for something to read that's brilliant. But I was sitting at an event with her in Vincennes in France, and I don't remember what the question was, but she was talking about the ability for crime fiction to serve as social novels in ways that no other genre could. And I had never really thought about it, but it was like, that is a really interesting idea. And the more I thought about it, I thought she was right. So the work kind of expands in this sense. And with this novel, it's a novel that's wrestling, very directly with issues of white supremacy. And so I say that for a couple of different reasons. For one, the conversations that we're going to have tonight and the conversations that are going to be had in this book are things that are likely to make white readers feel uncomfortable, and that was purposeful. But so conversations in this room tonight could get to places that make us feel uncomfortable. And I think as Americans, we have we're a fucking air conditioned culture. We do not enjoy being made uncomfortable. And we also have a really horrible way of only being willing to exist within our own echo chambers where the people we're surrounded by are saying the same things that we are. And anytime that's challenged, we just go to our corners and scream back and forth at each other. We've lost any ability to maintain civil discourse in this country. And so what I want to ask all of you of the audience tonight is that, for the next hour, I quite honestly do not give a flying fuck if nobody else in this country can have civil discourse in this current moment. I do care that everybody in this room can. And so for the next hour, if nothing else, let's try to embody that idea and that acknowledgement that it's okay to be made uncomfortable. It's okay to sit with things that challenge us. And maybe literature allows for that space in a way that nothing else can, because it's a safe space. You can get mad at that book and you can slam that book closed. You can throw it against a wall, and at the end of the day, it's just a book. So for the next hour, let's try to keep that in mind. But as far as where this novel comes from, it was something that in a lot of ways, I always knew that I wanted to do, in the sense that, like, all of my work is very specifically set in Jackson County, North Carolina, but this is not a novel that is about Jackson County, North Carolina. This is a novel that is very much informed by the history of the American South, but this is not a novel about the American South. This is an American novel, which is to say that despite what everybody else in this country might want to think and say that, yeah, that's a Southern problem, it's not a Southern problem. It's an American problem. But a key difference is that whereas a whole lot of the rest of the country is able to walk around with that in their back pocket and never pull it out and actually look at it. To be raised in the American South is to be raised in a place where it sits on top of the ground, where you encounter it every day of your life in some capacity or another. And so for me, it was, it became a reality that, I just thought I wrestled with all of my life. I'd looked at, all of the different ways that it had been approached in literature, and kind of thought about how my work might fit into that. And so it starts about 10 years ago is the very first scene that I ever write. That scene goes on to become the second chapter of this novel. But at the time, I was sitting in a firehouse every day. The firehouse she was saying I was sitting in because I don't have Wi-Fi in my house, so I have to travel if I have to do anything. But so I was sitting at a firehouse, doing that event. But I used to sit at that firehouse every morning. And my best friends at the time were the fire chief that worked there, the assistant fire chief that worked there, and someone who'd been in the sheriff's office, his entire career. So all these people were substantially older than me, but I just sat there and drank coffee with them every day because I loved the stories they told. I loved the way that they talked. I loved everything about it. And one day I was sitting there with the person who'd worked in the sheriff's office, and I brought up this person who I'd seen walking through town for years and years and years, and it was like there just has to be a story there. And so I asked him about him, and he told me this story of the first time that they ever encountered him and how they found him sleeping in his car. And when they pulled him out and started searching the vehicle, they found a notebook. The notebook was a contact list for local Klansmen. And I'll never forget him saying, he said it was people that I'd known all my life. He said it was people I went to church with. It was people I'd gone to school with. It was people, that I knew in some capacity or another by extension of one person. And as a writer, like, that's fucking gold. Like the only way that fiction functions is for me to, within a handful of pages, take you by the throat and refuse to let you go. Otherwise, you're going to put the book down. And so the type of hook you're looking for is that stranger shows up in a place, they search the car, here's a contact list. All of a sudden, you've got all of this exposed history. Like it had potential to be something. So I wrote that scene. And, the novel slowly continues to grow. And one of the main characters becomes a character named Toya Gardner, who is a young Black artist who's come into this town and is, in the words of John Lewis, stirring up good trouble. It's that she sees things that she believes the world needs to be paying attention to, and she forces them to look at it, and it unsettles the community that she's stumbled into. But originally, Toya had no deep connection to place. And if you know my work, you know that that is probably the quintessential ingredient. I don't write books about Appalachia. I don't write books about Western North Carolina. I write books that are set very specifically in Jackson County, North Carolina. And so the fact that she had no way to be rooted to there was problematic to me. But so I wrote all these scenes and this and that. And then, around 2018 or so, this novel is dedicated to a Black visual artist named Marie Cochran, who I love very deeply. But Marie and I were walking around the campus of Western Carolina, and she takes me up onto this hill and she shows me a plaque. And the plaque tells the history of this church that had been there, this cemetery that had been there. And I knew the church because the whole time I'd ever, lived in Jackson County, it was just off the backside of that mountain, located on the backside. What I didn't know was the history. And it was like all of a sudden I had a way to root Toya to that ground in a way that I didn't have before. And it was like all of a sudden I knew that she was somebody who had returned to her ancestral home to try and figure out who and where she'd come from. And so I want to just take you to that piece of ground to start things off and show you what that looks like. The graves took all night to dig. There were 7 in all, each between 5 and 6 feet deep, dug by a dozen pairs of hands. Some of the diggers brought gloves and they took turns sharing them with those who had not, so as to try to keep their hands from breaking. By the end, every hand was blistered and burning just the same. Their fingers hurt to straighten, their backs bent crooked as laurel. It was the middle of summer, but on the mountain the air was cool. Each time they swapped out of the graves to rest, their sweat chilled their bodies, and they welcomed that feeling, for the work had nearly set them afire. Katydids wailed from the trees, and it was that sound that dampened the chomp and clink of spades digging away at the earth, the labored breaths of those who drove their shovels deeper. Around midnight, campus police circled the parking lot once, making their rounds, but the diggers hid and were soon alone. The dirt rose mounded at the heads of the graves, and when the digging was done, they shuttled back and forth from pickup trucks to carry buckets filled with river stones. The young woman who'd planned this took the last of the work alone. She painted the river stones white, and with them she slowly formed letters on the mounds of clay at the head of each grave. She took her time with this part, as if it were some sort of meditation. Holding each rock with both hands, she slowly turned them until they seemed to show her their place, and when the last was set, a word was spelled. Even in the blue glow, she could read what was written, and with it finished, she stretched flat on the grass to watch the last of pinprick stars dim and fade as first light blanched the sky. Early on, she'd considered stretching black sheets over the ground to signify the open graves, but now that the work was done and her body ached, she was glad she had taken the tougher road. This was part of the story, and now she knew the details intimately. She rocked forward and wrapped her arms around her knees. Red mud was caked to the legs of her overalls. She could feel the clay dried like a charcoal mask against her face where she'd wiped away sweat with the backs of her hands. She grinned and slowly closed her eyes, satisfied with what they'd accomplished. When the first bird started to call, the people who'd helped her began to leave. All of them were white, save her, and some shook her hand while others hugged her neck. A young man named Brad Roberts was the last to go. He was a graduate student at the school and had been a tremendous help all summer with everything she was doing. Over the last 2 months, they'd spent time together nearly every day. He walked over and stood by her side. "It's powerful," he said, placing one hand gently at the back of her arm. "It really is, Toya." And his words filled her with pride. Once he was gone and she was alone, she slipped a folded piece of paper out of her back pocket. She opened the paper to a black and white photograph she printed at the library. In the picture, 19 men and women were gathered in front of a church. Most of the men wore mustaches and all of the women wore hats, every person dressed in their Sunday best. Her third great grandfather stood in the second row with his hand in his pocket, something she could tell because of the way his jacket angled across the waist of his slacks. He was tall and lean with a low brow that shaded his eyes, light-skinned compared to his wife who stood beside him. Her third great grandmother had a white knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, a wide brimmed black hat propped high on her head. In the woman's face, the girl could see her mother, traits that had carried down and were still traveling. As she stood there studying the faces in the photograph, the faces of where and whom she'd come from, she couldn't help feeling like they were watching her, their flat stares reaching somewhere far back inside her. It was as if there were a closet at the back of her heart, and that image, coupled with the smell of the dirt, had somehow opened the door she had not known lay closed. She folded the photograph and slid it back into her pocket, then walked across the courtyard to a sidewalk by the road. A small bronze plaque had been placed there long ago to dedicate the ground, and it was this plaque that had led to this. Over the course of the summer, she'd stood here dozens of times and read what was written until the lines were memorized. On this site, in 1892, 11 former slaves founded the Cullowhee African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. The congregation, church, and cemetery moved in November 1929 to make room for the construction of Robertson Hall. The plaque, of course, did not tell the story. In truth, there were 86 bodies and an amputated arm, exhumed and reburied. When she'd asked her grandmother about what had happened, her grandmother had said that as a child, she'd been told that when they dug up the bodies, the hair of the dead had kept growing, a grisly detail she didn't know whether to believe or dismiss as some scary story intended to frighten children. Looking back, her grandmother thought it was most likely true. Her voice had trembled as she said this. In a whole lot of ways, the young woman thought, pain had been passed down from one generation to the next, and that's what so many people never could understand unless it was their history, unless this was their story. For certain groups in America, trauma was a sort of inheritance. The young woman turned from the plaque to the three-story building that stood in place of the church, the red brick walls warming in color as sunlight started to reach them. The courtyard and grave still rested in shade from a tall hedgerow of pines, and she walked with her hands locked together at her chest for one last look before going. The stones were brighter now, and under her breath she read what they spelled aloud. In the beginning, there was only the Word. That's the end of the first chapter. And so what has happened is that Toya has learned this history, and there's this graffiti element to her art, which is to say that in my mind, graffiti is the act of placing art in places where art is not supposed to exist. And there's a moment later in the novel where she's asked, why she did things the way that she did. And she basically says, I could have painted a painting, or I could have made a sculpture, and we could have put it in a studio space in a gallery. She said, but what would it matter if the people who needed to encounter the idea never stepped foot in the gallery? And so what she's done is opened up this place in a way that the university is suddenly going to have to reckon with the history that they would choose not to. And she's arrested for this. And the sheriff in this novel is very close friends with her grandmother and her family. And he's, basically saying, I don't know how I'm going to get you out of this. And she says, I'll be out of here by supper time. And he's saying, well, what makes you think that? She says, it's simple. She said, it's optics. Because how would it look if they didn't? And she's right. If something like that were to happen, the university may, arrest her at the moment. But if the university starts pressing charges and doing this and that, how's that going to play out on the news? Not very well, right? So it's, But so when she's let out, she's walking through town, and she encounters a Confederate statue that stands in Sylva, North Carolina, and she suddenly sets her sights on something bigger. And when this happens, you know, the ground of Jackson County is suddenly shaken, and you know, this novel is very much an examination of looking at a community at a fracture point. And that's kind of the way that this novel plays out. You know, that's the setup. And it's very much a novel that is attempting to force white characters into difficult conversations. And by extension, force white readers into difficult conversations. Because the reality is that, you know, I think that outside of moments of Black death and Black trauma, we're not having these conversations. You know, we're always, and even when we do have them in those instances, it's only so long as we can reach a moment of quiet where we can usher it back into the closet. And then, thank God we don't got to talk about that anymore for a little while. And we have a very real problem of doing that again and again in this country. You know, I think about a moment like the shooting in the supermarket in Buffalo, New York, where a man walks into that supermarket. He has the N-word written on the front side of an AR-15 rifle. He has "Here's your reparations" written down the side, and he commences to murdering people. And who knows what happens the next week? Anybody? Uvalde. Right, the school shooting in Uvalde, and all of a sudden, we're not talking about what happened in Buffalo, New York anymore. We're not talking about, you know, that. And part of it is that there was something else we needed to focus on, but it was also another example of it being very convenient for us not to wrestle with issues of white supremacy and how they affect, you know, Black communities again and again. You know, when I think about the reason that 2020 was such an unsettling moment for this country, there were a lot of things. But one of the biggies was that we never reached that moment where there was enough time between incidents to where we could usher the monster back into the closet, right? Like you start with Ahmaud Arbery being chased down and shot in the streets like a fucking dog. You jump forward a month and it's Breonna Taylor being killed by police in Kentucky. You jump forward, you know, a couple more months and the whole world watches as Derek Chauvin kneels on the neck of George Floyd and he cries out for his dead mother until he's dead. And the whole world watches this. And suddenly the whole country is just at this boiling point. And, you know, I think for the generation that's coming up now, that will be a signature event for them. And it's not that it won't be for me, but there were other events that I'll remember. And that, you know, there are people in this crowd who are older than me, and there are other events that you'll remember, which is to say that there is a cyclical nature to every bit of this. And the most disturbing thing is that it's happening again and again and again and again, and we just keep refusing to talk about it. This novel, I just kept thinking about, you know, that interview with Toni Morrison and Charlie Rose in 1993, sometime in August, almost 30 years ago to the date. You know, but at one point in the conversation, Toni Morrison looks at him and says, "White people in this country have a very serious problem." And she said, "You need to take me out of it." And what she meant by that was clean up your own fucking house. It was that I can't be asked to carry the burden of this conversation. It was that we needed to be having those discussions. And I jumped forward 30 years and we're still not having the discussions. At least we're not having the discussions in any sort of meaningful, lasting way. And for me, a lot of it just boils down to the fact that we refuse to be made uncomfortable for any length of time. So that's, you know, this is a feel-good book of the year is what I'm getting. No, of course it's not that. This is a book that's probably going to make you uncomfortable. You know, I've been on the road for 2 weeks, and so I'm kind of feeling out what this conversation looks like and what, you know, these events look like. And one of the things I recognized early was that I have just laid a fuck ton of weight in everybody's lap in this room, right? And one of the mistakes was that the way that I approached the idea of questions didn't leave space for you to ask me things that have nothing to do with this book and nothing to do with the issues that are raised in this book. And you most certainly can ask me anything you want. You can ask me about past books. You can ask me about writing. You can ask me most assuredly about turkey calls or catching flathead catfish, or, you know, things that I know a great deal about. But don't feel obligated to engage those questions in this room. But do enter this novel being willing to sit with those questions in the comfort of your own home. Because like I said earlier, I think that's probably the greatest gift that art and literature provide, is that they provide a safe space for us to sit with things that challenge us. So how about some questions?
Okay, so how about one from the virtual audience
All right.
to kick it off? You sort of talked about this a little bit, or why not take it directly? Love all your books, says Dennis. And the question is, do you get frustrated by the label of being a, in air quotes, regional novelist? Your work, as well as Ron Rash, and Wiley Cash, etc., explore universal themes, not just Southern.
Yeah. So can everybody hear the question that was asked? So with regards to like classifications in literature, you know, I'm wearing this shirt, which is a podcast. Read Appalachia is a wonderful podcast where you can engage with a lot of Appalachian writers, right? But so one of the problems with thinking about Appalachia is like people keep talking about it as if it's a place, like I've been there, as if it's like a place you just drive through and grab a fucking cup of coffee. You know, and we're talking about a region that is, you know, 40,000 square miles bigger than the state of California. You know, it's a region that stretches across 13 states and 420 counties, you know, 205,000 square miles, which is to say that if you grew up in Haywood County, North Carolina, you don't know dick about coal. You just don't. You know, this is not the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky or West Virginia. So the entire concept is problematic, is what I'm getting at. You know, even when we think in terms of regionality, it doesn't operate, right? When we think of in terms of Southern, it doesn't operate. It's too expansive. But for me, it's something that I never worry about. And it's, you know, I always fall back to that, you know, Eudora Welty idea that one place understood helps us understand all places better. And she was reiterating something, you know, that James Joyce said when they asked James Joyce, why do you only ever write about Dublin? And he said, if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all cities of the world. Which is to say that if I write a story that is wrestling with some of the most difficult things about what it means to be human in this country and in this moment, it is not an Appalachian novel. It is not a Southern novel. And it is an American novel, but it's an American novel that then extends to, you know, to French readers, and they read it and suddenly there's an illumination there. It's not a limiting factor, is what I'm getting at. I could write any book I ever wanted to, and I could set it in Jackson County, and it could carry the weight of anything that anyone else could write anywhere in this world. You know, because all of the elements are there. You know, art is working to do a couple of things, but one is elicit some type of emotional response. And I don't really care what it is, you know, whether you're laughing or you're crying or you're happy or you're sad, just as long as you feel something. And then the other thing is that it needs to illuminate some aspect of the human condition. And when you think about a writer like Ron Rash, sure, he's writing about Appalachia. but he's writing about what it means to be a human on this earth, you know, what it means to feel. And that's the universality that exists in art and literature.
So let's I'll move up here so I can try to see you all better. Question from the live audience.
Given Jackson County, as you described, is typically where someone with an author would grow up. So what was your path to becoming a writer?
Yeah. So a lot of people think I grew up in Jackson County, and I didn't. I grew up in what is now Charlotte. I grew up to, you know, like we were saying, you know, I'm a 12th generation North Carolinian. My first ancestor wanders out of Virginia into what becomes Bertie County in the late, you know, 1600s. By the mid 1700s, they're all kind of right there along the Catawba River Valley. And I grew up to a very rural people who had been swallowed by a city. And it's funny that, you know, this played out in the news last week. There was this giant ass, you know, Texas Longhorn that was running through a section of Charlotte and causing all of these traffic problems. And it was my parents' neighbors. And like, that's the cattle pasture that I grew up running through. You know, every afternoon I ran through that cattle pasture to fish a farm pond. I grew up riding around with a grandmother who still pointed the fields and said, you know, I used to work tobacco in that field, or I worked cotton in that field. And she pointed to houses that her father had built or her brothers had built. So I grew up to a place in a place where people were very rooted to landscape. And when I came here, you know, I moved to Jackson County when I was 18. I've been here a little over half my life. And I came chasing a girl, and that didn't work out. But the thing that stuck with me was that I immediately recognized that so many of the things I'd witnessed be erased were still present in the community that I found myself. And I latched onto it. Like, when I think about why did I spend the time that I did sitting in that firehouse, it was that, you know, I was in my early 30s and I was sitting with men who were, you know, in their 60s. And it was the language, it was the stories, it was the attachment to place. And I became really, you know, the one theme that kind of runs through all of my work is the erasure of culture. You know, I've said time and time again that I think we're within a generation of the culture that we know as mountain culture being a thing of the past. You know, we're witnessing a mass extinction in a whole lot of ways. And like, that's the reason I latched onto it the way I did, was because I'd already watched it be erased. Like, you can't go back to the place I came from. It's that Gertrude Stein idea that there is no there. You can't go to Paul Creek. You can't go to Berry Hill. You can't go to Steel Creek. You can't go to Morris Chapel, where I grew up. Those places don't exist anymore outside of cursive writing on the signage in front of fucking little boxes made of ticky tack. You know.
So, question from the virtual audience. In your book, why did you choose to capitalize the word white as a racial descriptor in it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it was something that I wrestled with, and I couldn't figure out what to do. I wound up deciding to capitalize the word white as a racial descriptor. And then when we were working through the process with an authenticity reader who looked at the manuscript later, they reiterated that they thought it was a smart choice. And I will lean heavily on her, you know, her reasoning here, which is that she thought that it directly confronted ideas of white normativity. Which is to say that if I write a character in a book, in literature, the assumption is that you're talking about a white person. It's that, you know, something that looks like me is normal, and that everything else is the other. And not only that everything else is the other, but that everything else is bad, or carries some type of stigma. And so when you look at the way that words are capitalized, and so the way that the word black is capitalized as a descriptor of race and literature, the fact that white is not becomes problematic, because you're drawing attention to one and you're not drawing attention to the other. So another really bad, I'm sorry, I keep looking at you. You asked me the question. I'll try to look here, look at you, because you're the one who asked. But it extends in so many other aspects too, which is to say that, like, when we're describing the way that a white person exists on the page, we don't accentuate all of these other characteristics in the way that we would a black character or an Asian character or, a Latinx character, because white is normal. And so it becomes a matter of wrestling with that. And so, the only way to directly address any of that is to, one, make it something that extends across everything, at some sort of equal level, and then to also move into the narrative with that idea of, if you're going to describe one person in depth, you need to describe everyone in those same types of terms, which is something that I think I'd always kind of done anyways, but it was something that you balance in a very different way when you're having the types of conversations we're having about this book, and when you've written a novel that's wrestling with the things that this book is attempting to wrestle with.
In person? Yes.
A couple of comments. First, I want to tell you that When These Mountains Burn, the final 7 pages, the most beautiful writing, most thoughtful writing I've ever seen on adapting to the change in the mountain environment, mountain culture. I would recommend people read the other 250 pages also. But on the FY basis, I know your book centers around a Confederate monument in front of the courthouse in Silver. We had a big controversy here over the Pack Square monument and obelisk, I guess it is. And next to nobody understands that obelisk was built by George Pack, who was a fervent abolitionist. And he built it for his friend and governor. And I'm not an advanced defender. His racist comments are on the record, as is our former president and the governor of Florida and others. But if Vance was so virulently racist, why would an abolitionist honor him? I just throw that out as an FYI. And I am curious for you to tell us more about your character Cawthorn in this book, because in Buncombe County, we slaughtered him by 32,500 votes. And he still won by 50,000 votes because of Western North Carolina mountain region put him in the United States House of Representatives. And these people here, I can't speak for all of them, obviously, slaughtered him by 32,500 votes. So we were stuck with Cawthorn, and we're stuck with not much better. At least we have a breeding organism in the House of Representatives. But I just wonder how you brought Cawthorn.
Yes. Well, super complicated question and a whole fucking lot to unpack. And that's not to say at all that I'm unappreciative, because I am. So first, let's go back to the idea of the monument. And I think one of the things that you're getting at that is really important for us to recognize is the complicated nature of history and the way that history has been taught in this country. And I think about the mishistory that has taken place in the American South, and that is something I really want to focus my conversations on. But it feels like you have to also, because that didn't take place everywhere else in the country. They didn't grow up learning about the Civil War the way that Southerners grew up learning about the Civil War. But if we're going to think about it as a further extension, let's think about the way that like American history plays out in this country, right? And we think about the moments of the American Revolution, and it looks like a fucking Marvel movie. You know, it's like George Washington on the front of a boat like this, you know, this big muscular white guy who, you know, who's going to do all of these great things. And we know that image, but we never take in the fact that, as you know, someone like Thomas Jefferson is writing about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the man bringing him the pen is most likely his wife's half brother, who was the result of her father having most likely sexually assaulted a woman that he had enslaved, which is to say that our history lacks context. And that is true across our entire nation with the entire idea of the American story. But in the South, that plays out in a different way as well, in that you've got a multi-generational miseducation, which is to say that the things that we were taught, it wasn't, in some cases it was outright lies, but in other cases it just lacked context. You know, it was like, well, what was this about? You know, it was about states' rights. Well, yeah, states' rights to do what? Or it was about industrialized North trying to, you know, take away things from an agricultural South. Well, yeah, an agricultural South that was what? You know, dependent on free labor of enslaved peoples. That's the only way that cotton's fucking profitable. That's most assuredly the only way that sugar's profitable. But that to say that it's a history that lacks context. And so we think about a moment like, you know, like the Cornerstone speech, you know, where Jefferson Davis is laying out what the Confederacy is and what it will be. And the Vice President, Alexander Stephens, stands there and he says, you know, its foundation is laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and born condition. That's what the man says. And we jump forward 160 years and it becomes very hard for me to entertain the idea that it wasn't about that. And yet none of that is taught, nor are we taught the fact that jump forward 10 years after, you know, and where is Alexander Stephens? Does anybody know? He's the fucking governor of Georgia, right? Which is to say that they immediately go back into power. Reconstruction is a short-lived breath, and all of a sudden we usher in an era of Jim Crow that we're still living in the fucking shadow of. But the complications that exist between all of that and between the mishistory make every bit of it complicated as hell. It is a tough place to navigate. It's a tough conversation to navigate. Like that is one of the greatest roadblocks in talking about white supremacy in this country. And especially about talking about white supremacy in the American South. And so when I think about a statue like that, it lacks context in the same way that you just provided context. And I don't know that history. But what I will say is that when it honors a man, you know, who said the things that he said, I have to wonder about what is the impression that is left on everybody who looks at it. It's like the Confederate flag became something that symbolized all of these different things to people. You know, I grew up being dragged to fucking Leonard Skinner shows my whole life. And every time that damn Sweet Home Alabama played, you know, a 200-foot by 60-foot Confederate flag dropped down the back of the stage. And that was the moment everybody went wild. And if we had went around and polled, what does that mean to you? I very seriously doubt that it would have meant what Alexander Stephens said it meant. But it doesn't matter if the person standing in front of it when they walk up those steps in silver looks at it, and to them it means fucking chains. To them, it refers to a moment when they weren't counted on a census as people, when they were counted as chattel, as property. And it's a very difficult conversation to navigate. And it is because it's so complicated and so much of it lacks context, and we're all coming from different places. With the idea, okay, second question, with the idea of Cawthorn, I named that character for that reason, absolutely. Which is like, we've got this, like Cawthorn in this novel is a dipshit overt racist. And when I think of the most dipshitted overt racist of the past however many years, it's him. It's him. But for me, this novel was a matter of looking at white supremacy like an onion and just peeling back layers and peeling back layers and peeling back layers. And people like Cawthorn are that papery thin bullshit. Like, toss me a white onion and I can rub my hands over it and that's gone. The thing at the heart of that onion are things that are a lot more quiet. In this state, it's things like gerrymandering districts. There's all these things playing out at levels that are a lot more dangerous than some dipshit like Madison Cawthorn. But that was one of the reasons I named that character that. As far as what's playing out here politically, again, super complicated, super complicated, which is to say that a whole lot of these counties around here were historically Blue Dog Mountain Democrats. Like, you look at a place like Madison County and it looks a very certain way now, but go read the history about the Ponder machine. The politics shifted in ways here, in ways that weren't true for other parts of the country. But that just to say that it's all super complicated. And I appreciate the hell out of you asking the question. And I appreciate the hell out of you sitting there and letting me answer it. Because I'm sure that, like, if you and I were sitting at a table, now would be the time that I handed you the microphone and asked you to keep talking. And I mean that wholeheartedly, which is to say that that's the way a conversation is meant to function. How about another?
How about another? All right, this one will be maybe complicated, maybe not. Let's see. But seriously, asked Carl, what or who inspired you to become a writer?
If I'm pointing at one person, it's my grandmother, which is to say that I grew up in an oral storytelling tradition where children were expected to be seen and not heard. And like, you sat there and I was surrounded by family all the time. And they were always telling stories. It was usually about fishing. And I grew up in that, just like, some of my favorite memories are being a little kid and just kind of traveling from pocket to pocket outside of church on a Sunday morning. And, when church let out, everybody broke into their groups. And as a kid, you just kind of wandered around and it was storytelling, like you were surrounded by story. And to this day, my grandmother was the greatest storyteller I ever knew. And, for me, I think I recognized really early that I couldn't tell one verbally, but that maybe I could write one. And so I started, trying to do that. And so I think that was pivotal. And then when I look at finding my own voice and really dialing in what it was that I wanted to do, it was very much Ron Rash handed me a copy of William Gay's I Hate to See That Evening Sun Go Down. And it was the very first time that I realized somebody could tell a story like that you could talk about the people that I knew, that they could talk the way that I talked, that you could set it in the places I'd been walking around my whole life. Before that, I thought it was all, elbow patches and buckles on your shoes. That, like, being a writer looked a certain way. and that it was an academic pursuit. And maybe it still is an academic pursuit, but there are very few people working in academia who could write a fucking sentence like William Gay, who hung drywall. And so it was a matter of finding that voice, and that was a moment that, you know, in a lot of ways really set me on fire.
Final question from the in-person audience, and not one like that one. Say that with the book signing part when you talk today.
Asby's got his hand up.
I'm sorry, let me get Kelly and then we'll get you and both brief.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Hey, David, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing. It's really interesting that you brought up Buffalo and Uvalde in terms of, you know, we all know that young white men killed this minority folks. Like, how do you feel the lack of gun safety legislation and how do you, like, you say that this story could be told everywhere, but I don't think it could be in Europe or France or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Be done here.
Yeah.
And so, what are your thoughts in terms of like how that issue can be addressed to further equality? Because I don't want to give spoilers away, but everyone can go for one.
Yeah. So one, I think you're right in that in terms of the conversation you're wanting to have, it is strictly an American phenomenon. You know, absolutely. And you couldn't write a French novel that functioned that way. But the American novel would extend into France, and they would hopefully understand some things about, you know, America. But you know, I was on a panel. Asheville had this thing called the Asheville Ideas Fest. Did anybody attend that or know what that was? Okay, it was kind of this really cool project where they had all of these panels, you know, discussing different topics. And I sat on a panel that was about the Second Amendment. And I was brought in there because I'd written about the Second Amendment in an article for the New York Times Magazine. I sat on the panel with someone whose mother had been murdered in the Charleston church shooting, who was a child at the time and who was kind of thrown into a life of activism. And I sat on the panel with a woman who was heading part of the Brady organization, you know, which is doing a whole lot of things, but you know, dealing with these issues. And I sat with a woman who'd worked for the NRA, and she'd worked for lots of different people, but there were all of these different perspectives that were taking place on that. And actually, I'm going to be on a podcast with the lady from the Brady organization sometime next month. And part of the reason I agreed to do that was that I didn't feel like we ever got to a discussion of, well, what does sensible gun reform even look like? Or what are the problems we're trying to look at? Because you had a panel where everybody had a whole lot of fucking expertise, and they were trying to shovel it into a, you know, a 1 hour bite, and it just didn't work. But when I look at what happened in this country, like it's a 22-year phenomenon, which is to say that there are very few people in this room that are substantially younger than me. I keep looking at you. How old are you?
I'm
19. So this is the only, the reason I asked that question is that the only generational understanding you have of gun culture in America is a post 9/11 gun culture. I grew up with guns on the wall my whole life. You know, I grew up to people who hunted, you know, my whole life. And it wasn't that the types of guns we're talking about didn't exist before that, because they most assuredly did, you know, and you could go to, you know, gun shows and see them because I did. But you didn't go into Walmart and see them. And there came a moment after 9/11 where the two things line up too tightly for it to be associated with anything else, which was a moment of extreme xenophobia, Islamophobia, nationalism. They're coming for us, grab your fucking guns. And all of a sudden, the militarization of gun culture combined with the economics of what capitalism looks like in this country became something that equated ideas of liberty and freedom with a type of weapon that leads to the types of issues we're talking about here. You know, issues like Uvalde, issues like, you know, the Buffalo shooting. You know, all of a sudden it was buckets of ammunition being sold as freedom buckets. You know, and that's how it's marketed, right? And so there was it's a very short time span we're talking about. It was a very deliberate shift, and nobody is willing to have real conversations about any of it, right? Like the gun industry keeps fucking finding ways to wiggle around legalities. You know, and that's one of the things I'm hoping we'll talk about on that, you know, on that podcast, is just simple things that are failures of the ATF, that are failures of courtrooms. You know, and until we get to those very specific things, because what happens is, all right, let's say that I'm an NRA person and I know everything there is to know about guns, and I start trying to have this conversation with you, and I know you. Personally, I know you. If I'm an NRA guy, I don't. But what I'm getting at is we start having this conversation and we start having a discussion of things that are very specific, and it becomes me completely dismissing what you're trying to say because you don't know all of the things, right? Like, you don't know what defines a weapon this way. You don't know what the law was that went into place to why you can't own short-barreled rifles, or, you know, or short-barreled shotguns, why you can't own this, the hoops you have to jump through. And then the minute that happens, the entire conversation falls apart. When the truth is that there are very specific things we can be talking about. You know, you think about a moment like Stephen Paddock shooting down into that crowd in Las Vegas from a hotel, and it was the very first moment that anybody in this country heard, unless you're a gun person, who'd heard the term bump stock, right? Which was a product that was added to a weapon in order to increase rate of fire of a semi-automatic weapon. Sole fucking purpose of it. They can say that's the sole fucking purpose of it. Things like that are a failure of the ATF for approving it. And when it plays out in a courtroom, if it's allowed, it's a failure in that courtroom. But those are the conversations we need to be having. And those are the very real types of things that can change what it all looks like. I'm going to spend tomorrow in a gun shop. I'll sit there all day because that's where the people are that I love. They don't have any of those types of weapons for sale. But that's where I'm going to sit all day. And I can guarantee you I won't encounter a single person in there who wouldn't care to wait for a crazy extended amount of time to purchase another gun. I've bought 4 guns this year. And if you said, David, you got to wait a month, David, you got to wait, I don't give a shit. As long as we get it before duck season, or, you know, like if you need a gun and you need a gun now, there's a fucking problem. And odds are that gun ain't gonna fix it. But those are the types of conversations that can be had. And again, it's just that the sad truth in this country is we are unwilling to have civil discourse.
The last question from the gentleman there, and then we're wrapping it up. Go ahead.
David, I'm not sure what sort of research surrounded your writing of those we thought we knew, but at one time, Western North Carolina area was very well known to have not embraced the Confederacy and thoughts and philosophical beliefs that underpinned the Confederacy. How did things evolve from your perspective from that reality to the times and the realities that you explore in your latest novel? How did we get from what was somewhat promising to something so dark in more recent times?
Yeah, well, I think that's another thing where it's really complicated. So you look at a place like Wilkes County in North Carolina, and it was very much, a pro-union spot in North Carolina. Henderson County's got a really interesting history, but it was complicated in all these different places. Even you think about, Ron's written about it, like the story of the Lincolnites, at the end of Burning Bright. But it's a really complicated past where not everybody, fall in it's not like fucking Mississippi. It's not like the Piedmont of North Carolina even. It's not that cut and dry. But as far as how we get to the moment where that's what's standing in front of a courthouse, it's that era after Reconstruction, where suddenly all of the power that had been held finds its way back into a place, and these monuments are erected very much as a reminder of who's still in charge. I'm not a historian, and I cannot think of another example in the world where the loser got to put up trophies. Somebody was having this conversation with me the other day, and I don't like this comparison, but they were making the comparison to Nazi Germany, and that there were plenty of people who fought in Nazi Germany who may not have carried the beliefs of a man like Adolf Hitler. And I'm sure that's true. But the difference would have been that at the end of that war, jump forward 10 years and we're putting up Nazi monuments, and Goebbels is put in charge of, one of the fucking municipalities. That doesn't happen. The only place that I know of that ever happened is in this country. And I think you combine that with the miseducation that took place, and you get a whole lot of people who love to scream about history who don't know a whole lot about history. I say proudly that I'm a 12th generation North Carolinian, and I am proud of that. But you can't make a statement like that without openly acknowledging that someone in your family's history was most likely an enslaver. And in the case of my family history, they most assuredly were. I can't make a statement like being a 12th generation North Carolinian and not acknowledge that there were a whole lot of people in my family's history who fought to preserve the institution of slavery. Those are not easy things to say, right? Like that's ugly. And we've got to this place where we believe that there's it's like you should feel like guilt, like white guilt or shame. That those terms get thrown around all the time, like white guilt. Well, no, you shouldn't feel guilty. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel ashamed of it. What I would be ashamed of would be sitting in the shade of a tree like white supremacy. And being the direct beneficiary of that tree and not acknowledging that I'm sitting comfortably while everybody else is burning the fucking life. Like I would feel guilty about that. I would feel shameful about that. I don't feel guilty acknowledging that some of my family history is directly tied to all of those things we're talking about. But I say all of that to say that we've got to reach a moment where we lay the ugly on the table. Because for 300 years, we've been living in a fucking house that's taking on water. And the basement is full, the floor joists are rotten, the foundation is cracked, and we're all still sitting upstairs with our legs crossed on the TV watching reruns of Roseanne. And until we acknowledge all of these issues, and until we lay the ugly out on the table, you can't move forward. You know, the beginning of this novel, you know, what took place at Western Carolina University, that's not an indictment of Western Carolina University. I mean, it is, but it's an indictment of everything. It's an indictment of the performative gesture of renaming a building because you found out it was named after an enslaver, but still refusing to acknowledge that you made a Black community dig up their own fucking dead and take them to the backside of a mountain. You can't have real conversations until you lay it on the table. And we're going to have to be willing to be made uncomfortable, and we're going to have to be willing to sit with that uncomfortability for an extended period of time. And it's going to be a very difficult piece of land to walk. I mean, it is a minefield. And so much of it is those aspects of miseducation. Those aspects of constantly conflating race with class, you know, all of those things. But you know, we're getting nowhere by not talking about it. I mean, we've proven that. We know that doesn't work. So if nothing else, just try something different. Try something different. And if it's something as simple as sitting down and talking, I hope to God that the adults in the room can finally tell the fucking children we've put in charge to sit down and shut up. We're sick of listening to you. It's time for the adults to talk, you know, and I think that's the place that we've got to get as a country.
Well, David Jordan, thank you very much for being here.